Alaska. Located above Canada, it is the largest U.S. state. It became the 49th state in 1959. It is so big that it's 1/6 of the size of Europe. Alaska is best known for its biodiversity. You can find some of the most mesmerizing, beautiful views in Alaska. Alaska has 3 million lakes, more than 12,000 rivers, 6,640 miles of shoreline, thousands of wildlife, and even more volcanoes than Hawaii, and an estimated amount of 100,000 glaciers. It's no wonder why so many people come for the views. But Alaska is more than pretty views. It has a very rich food culture. So Alaskan cuisine has a very long history, but we can mainly trace it back to the 18th century. That's when the Russian immigrants arrived at Alaska. Why did they arrive? Well, you see, the Russian economy around this time was very heavily dependent on the fur trade. Because it was so heavily dependent on the fur trade, Russia was very interested in acquiring land that had animals they could use for the fur trade. So that's why you have a lot of Russian immigrants around this time. The Russians tried to grow their own crops, Russian cuisine really depended on bread. Bread was very common in Europe overall. Some of them tried to grow wheat, however, very few were successful. And you could also say, well, they could have just imported those ingredients. However, it was very rare for ships to arrive to Alaska because it was so far away and the population was very small. A lot of companies didn't think it was worth making the stop all the way at the Alaskan forts. So what happens is that the Russians start to adapt to the food that could be found there. Salmon, cod, halibut were very popular among the working class, or like the immigrants, and they were just very popular too because they were fresh ingredients, so they tasted better than these imported foods who were heavily processed and just not as good of a quality compared to the food that you could find in Alaska. Wild berries were also native to Alaska, and Russians also sort of adapted wild berries into their cooking. Like I've said before, fish was very popular. Many fishermen developed soup recipes, but not a lot of those recipes carried on into present days. Why? Well, you have the lack of resources. It's a very large land. There's not a lot of people. It's hard to communicate those recipes, so they're not getting passed on. So we don't have them today. In other places that were colonized, you have Europeans introducing their own ingredients and their own recipes, and the natives adapting to their European ways of cooking. The opposite happened in Alaska. Another reason why Russians adapted to native cooking, which by native cooking I mean adapting meats like yak, moose, whale, eagles, was because the Russians didn't have the skills to hunt. A lot of them were accustomed to consuming cows, but you couldn't herd cows in Alaska due to the climate. Eventually, Russia ended up selling the Alaskan territory to the US. Why? Well, it wasn't very profitable for them. They mainly wanted the land for the fur trade, and they didn't find a whole lot of animals they could use for the trade. A lot of people didn't work there for the fur trade. A lot of them were fishermen. And as we know today, Russia ended up selling the Alaskan territory to the United States. It was shortly after the American Civil War that Russia decided to sell the land. Now, the US purchased it for about $7.2 million, which was very cheap. And not right away did Americans begin moving to Alaska. It wasn't up until the late 1800s when gold was discovered that a lot of people were interested in going over there. So you have a lot of American immigrants moving to Alaska to work in the gold mines. Like the Russians, Americans faced the same problem, that they couldn't grow or obtain the crops they needed or the ingredients needed in order to make the food they wanted. However, canned food was already popular around this time, so you have more recipes being developed, and there's more mixing between Russian culture, native culture, and the American culture, which you didn't have before. What's very unique about Alaska is that you can find a lot of food that's not very common in other places. For example, a lot of the Inuit people up north still make the recipes or still cook in the same way that people cooked millions and millions of years before. The food culture in Alaska is very connected to nature. It is very common for people to fish or hunt with family or friends and later go to a park and cook the meal for everyone to enjoy. But if nature isn't really your thing, you can always go to a city and explore the various restaurants there are and enjoy beautiful views too. I can also guarantee you that you will find delicious king crab fish and chips, Russian salmon pies, Spanish, Mediterranean, or French food. You can also go to the state fair to find Alaskan treats such as whale, uknu, king crab, and more king crab, as well as Russian desserts. You can also get some exotic meats such as reindeer, hot dogs, as well as some yak burgers.